Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Manager with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. Our office investigates complaints of civil rights discrimination, combats human trafficking through the region, through the Prince George's County Human Trafficking Task Force, ensures equitable language access to county government services, and educates and provides opportunities for learning about social justice issues and diverse experiences. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome back Allison Pitinii Davis for a special Jewish American Heritage Month event discussing her incredible poetry collection, Line Study of a Motel Clerk, and how its themes resonate widely. Allison Pitinii Davis previously joined us as a guest when we featured the book What Things Cost, as she was a contributor to this absolutely beautiful anthology. Line Study of a Motel Clerk examines a family's century-long effort to make a home in a changing world. Pitinii Davis takes readers on a heart-stopping journey through her lineage with all the grit, beauty, and truth of the working-class immigrant struggle. One side of the family opens a trucking motel, the other a laundry. The businesses changed hands through 3 generations as the industrial Steel Valley booms and busts. When these 2 disparate families become one, the new generation must question what it means to endure a place, a culture, a language, and a history. So Allison Pitinii Davis is the author of Line Study of a Motel Clerk, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award and the Ohio Anno Book Award. Her work has appeared in or is forthcoming from Best American Poetry, the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day series, the New Republic, the Oxford American, and elsewhere. She received fellowships from Stanford University's Wallace Stegner program, the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, and the Severing House Beck Fund for Study at Vilnius Yiddish Institute. She holds a PhD in literature and creative writing. Allison, welcome. Thank you so much for coming back to be with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Kyla. I appreciate it.
I was hoping that to get us started tonight, you could introduce the book to us, because this is an incredible poetry collection. I know it came out a couple of years ago, and maybe not everyone's had a chance to read it yet. So can you take a few minutes and introduce the audience?
Yeah, thanks. This is Line Study of a Motel Clerk. It came out, my publisher is Boabab Press. They're out of Reno, Nevada, and run by, it's actually just recently closing, but my publisher ran an amazing independent bookstore there that I was lucky enough to get to go to. But a major reason I chose this publisher is because they also were coming from a small business background and really understood the project's goals. And so it's a project about thinking about really small family businesses and thinking about how it impacts people impacts the family not only financially, but also psychologically, how small family businesses often keep a lot of generations of a family in town. And so I'm from Youngstown, Ohio, which is a place where there was a lot of steel mills, and then a lot of these small family businesses kind of supporting the people working the steel mills. And in general, a lot of a poem I'll read here in a second talks about how it's a place in America that's really at the intersection of the Great Migration of Black workers coming north and immigrants coming west. So this area where people kind of are starting anew. And so my family story, or my family's interaction with that, is through 2 small businesses, a laundry, which recently closed, and a trucking motel, which is still open. It's been open since 1960. And thinking about how it passes through generations of my family. My collection in particular thinks about the role of women in these spaces, and also the role of just my generation that's a lot more assimilated than the generations that open these businesses, that are dealing with the kind of legacy of deindustrialization in the Rust Belt, and how to kind of navigate these economies as they've been changing. What to do about it now.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I was going to say, like, you've actually hit on areas in which I have questions, and so but I want to keep hearing from you. I was wondering, would you like to read a poem or two just to introduce the? Okay, that'll be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to read 3 poems from 2 different sections. that kind of, I think, hit on some of the themes I just spoke about as well. The first one is it closes section 1. Section 1 is called the 1970s, and it's about kind of my parents' courtship. So again, my mom grew up in this laundry environment. My dad grew up in a motel. I'll actually read maybe one extra one too, just to give you context about that. So this one is called Greetings from Across the Counter. Generation after generation wake up and worry about business. On my father's side, a trucking motel. My mother's side, a laundry. Of my parents, people asked, why is that Pitinii girl marrying a Jew, and vice versa? I'm their firstborn. I'll tell you why they married. My mother woke up asking starch or no starch, and my father answered smoking room or none. So that poem is kind of about how, even though they grew up in these different heritage or different backgrounds, they ultimately had the same vocabulary when it came to how they were raised in terms of small family businesses. This next one ends that section. It's about my father driving out to the motel to check on business. It's kind of after the steel economy in Youngstown has collapsed. And the middle stanza here kind of talks about the different kinds of intersectional oppression that unfortunately are still a major issue in Youngstown. And this one, you have to know, not just peanuts, was this takes place when Jimmy Carter was president, and that was one of his slogans. The motel clerk's son drives out to check on business. Before him, stickers fade across the bumper, not just peanuts. Last one out of town, turn out the lights. The last employer in Youngstown is the weather. The truck behind him plows gray snow to the roadside while another truck lays salt. Over and over, the radio says, prevent fuel line freeze up. You go or Ohio pays the toll. The radio signal spans the city, now bisected by 680, runs from the West Side widows prescribed shock treatment after their husbands fell dead on the lines, to the East Side workers who trained their white bosses, then got the slip. He pulls into the motel lot. Business is dead. Inside the office, he stares into the weather hitting the window. A wrecking ball crashed through this Ohio station across the street. What's left of it smiles back without its teeth. He says, that's what you get for opening your mouth. Mm-hmm. I should have also mentioned in that one, the part about bisected by 680. 680 is the highway running through Youngstown, and like many cities, the kind of highway projects that were made to develop suburbia ended up really impacting infrastructure downtown, often ended up really, running straight through Black communities that, at one point had a road there or, a street there, and sidewalks, became just a highway running down the middle. So major, as the economy moved from downtown Youngstown to the suburbs, the highway further disrupted a lot of those economies. And I'll read one more. This one is about, it's from section 3, which is more from kind of my generation's perspective. And this is about, I've been lucky, and I wrote a lot of this book while I was on fellowships in other places that were not Youngstown. A lot of places that were a lot wealthier than Youngstown. And I was just kind of blown away by how wealthy places are able to preserve their history in ways that poor places are not. So this is, I wrote this in Boston, but thinking back to Youngstown, and then thinking even farther back towards my family's kind of earliest immigration to the country. And this poem mentions Charles Resnikoff, who is a Jewish poet, a documentary poet. He wrote in kind of the early to middle.
Okay, so that was actually you're getting one of my questions. That was one of my questions. Can you talk a little, because he's thematic in the collection, and I want to hear the poem, but because, maybe read the poem and let's talk about him.
Yes, and he's a great labor poet too, so I can't wait to talk about Resnikoff. All right, so this one is Walking Far from Home with Charles Resnikoff, smiling up at me from my book. I am late for a bus and know I will miss it and need to kill 3 hours until the next. I imagine Resnikoff happy. We get to walk more, past Revere's grave, through North End's banners of cannoli ads. Boston has the money to stay old. In Youngstown, it'd be a parking lot. Back home, people fight to save facades, or even bricks, or even the thought of bricks. The only safe history is in the Steel Museum, where, for $7 a ticket, Ellis Island meets the Great Migration. A sign warns to touch may result in death in Croatian, Hungarian, Slovak. Owners discourage English so workers don't unite. Exploitation speeds up and assimilation slows down until, walking through the exhibits, I become one, a child of the Rust Belt, raised in a little Greece with everyone wiping my face with a panini. I love my home as Reznikov's of New York, the diaspora he carefully stacked atop his father's diaspora, then set forth across at street level, the altitude my aged uncle wandered alone, the first in his family to leave Poland, so much older than my great-grandmother, she wasn't born. Who knows what he did alone in the city, younger than me. If Reznikov passed him on those streets, he surely didn't notice him, among the Yiddish street signs without time to lose, immediately advertising and advertising.
Thank you. Thank you. So I love this collection so much. And so for those of you watching at home, you may or may not know that we actually had this scheduled for May 2nd. And so I read the collection in advance of that. I was all ready to go. And then just due to a family emergency on my end, we had to reschedule it. So I got to reread it over the last few days to be ready. And like every time I open it and I look at the poems and I read it or I didn't dive in. And my sense of it is it's meant to be read. With some poetry collections, I feel like sometimes you can dive in. And this one, I felt like each poem stood alone, but the collection itself, to me, made so much sense reading it from front to back. And so can you talk a little bit, like, am I right in that? Like that it is a narrative piece, right?
Yeah, I'm actually teaching a class on this right now. So we talk about this a lot. I think a little bit about poetry, how I think prose writers think about constructing a collection, and that it's meant to tell, in this book at least, is meant to tell a story. And shout out to one of my old professors, Michelle Herman. I actually wrote a lot of this in a creative nonfiction class. And she was like, your story's good, but you're a poet. You're not a creative nonfiction writer, which was great. So I already kind of had this kind of plot line mapped out that I was then kind of able to translate into poetry, like across genre, which is why it's so good to write in different genres and to do lots of different kinds of art, because sometimes you figure out the structure in one genre, but your kind of modality, what you're making the art in, is better in a different genre. So that was really important. Yeah, I also think there's so much pressure in speaking about just like poetry and capitalism and how we market literature and art. There's so much pressure to have like the standalone poem or the standalone piece. And one thing I really value in art is this idea that it can be slower. Poems can support each other. We could have anthologies, like What Things Cost, where we have a lot of different voices coming together and creating a larger narrative than we could create just by ourselves or just individually. So I hope that, and I appreciate the ways in which I hope some of the poems support each other and build off of each other and need each other. And when I publish my poetry, it's often, if I send out the poems individually, they'll get rejected. If I send out like the same poems together, they'll all get picked up at the same time. So I think I inherently write that way, where I think about things being interconnected. And part of that's definitely how I was raised, right? I was raised into small family businesses. I had like 30 first cousins growing up around me. Family unit, because of these small family businesses, no one left town because so many people from the families worked in them, that I didn't grow up really feeling like an individual. I was part of this larger unit. So I think my poems aren't individuals in that sense either. They're kind of family members of each other.
I love that. That is wonderful. I need to pull out that quote and send it to you because that was really great. And I was like, how was it for you then on a personal level to come out of Youngstown and you talked during your introduction that you had gone to places, you have fellowships in other places. Like, how was it for you to go and live in other spaces after having this closeness of Youngstown and your family and all of that connectivity?
It was really hard. I just went to Cincinnati for college and then, Columbus for my master's. And even that was in Cincinnati. I was, no family there. And that was hard enough as it was. And then I moved across the country to Palo Alto for the Stegner. It was just like another world. It was wonderful. It was great. But I really missed home. And like many writers, once you have that distance from the place that kind of is responsible for your psychology, that distance really makes you aware of it in ways that you aren't as aware of it when you're living in it. So I wrote most of the poems in this collection out there. So
I lived in a small town in British Columbia until I was 14, and I am way past 14 now. And I find when I do fiction, like it's completely oriented in a small town in British Columbia, even though I've been in many other places since then. And, 14 years is not a significant portion of my life. So I really get that way that a place can sort of become foundational to who you are. I want to talk, there's a lot I want to talk about. And I think we're kind of glancing over a lot of it. But you had said, again, going back to something that you'd said, you talked about the poems being together. And I'd actually made a note here, which I'm going to read to you. I said, cleaning motel rooms at night and another day shift come next to each other in the collection. I love these and I love them together. And that was, so as you were talking about like the way the poems supported each other, like this comment that I made really jumped out at me. And so I don't know if you're willing to read a little bit more, but if you could read those two poems side by side and then maybe we could talk about them. I'd love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Cleaning motel rooms at night. 17, a virgin, I clean motel rooms, stripping down the beds, dumping ashtrays, cleaning until desk, sheet, and Bible fix in a trinity. I clean because I'm the boss's daughter, surrounded by actual women who clean for a living, who call me sweetie, unless I'm wiping down a door, unless I approach love backwards through its aftermath. The threadbare cup fitter slumping to the floor, the fit of new sheets taut as longing across the bed. The room is ready, waiting in the stillness of an Ohio summer night. I look back at the floral spread and try to imagine a man, but cannot. A clean room is a clean room, a space straightening endings and beginnings into a line. To break it, there's a price. Up in the darkness, the rate flashes on the sign. Another day shift. This one has an epigraph, which is a famous rabbinic axiom. There is no before or after in the Torah. My father dials wake-up calls in the dark rooms, ringing. I brew a pot of office coffee and restock beer. Outside the window, the exit fills with semis. We're sitting where his father sat. The window uses us to tell the year.
I love that line so much. The window uses us to tell the year. Like that really hit me. So can we talk a little bit about those two poems?
Yeah. Cleaning motel rooms at night. I just finished a novella that is really about thinking about gender in these spaces, especially the trucking motel. It's a place that, especially being an oldest child and especially being an oldest daughter, and especially like this one starts out talking about being a virgin till 17. Beyond that, I won't talk about all that. That's a different book, right? But there was definitely this sense of I was expected to be very modest because maybe people didn't expect that of me or something, or like because I'm in a trucking motel, I would be somehow promiscuous or something. So it's always this kind of implication of there was some relationship between gender and between being a woman and this trucking motel environment that I had to be kind of alert about. And my novella that's coming out, which is about two oldest daughters who are in small businesses and kind of how they are negotiating that, is very much kind of about this theme. And it was definitely a topic that even, I addressed in this poem, but it's a topic that even now, like I had to switch to fiction to really even talk about it. I feel like it's, it is my story to tell, but it's also like a business that's still operating. And the things I have to kind of say about it are, in a different space than the, financial realities of running a business. And I think about, a lot of this book talks about the different generations of women who've worked at my family's motel. And it's been, my great grandmother worked there. My grandma worked there. My mom does the book sometimes. I've worked there. Now my daughter, has been in the office. So it's like 5 generations of women working in the space that's a pretty like male dominated space. And in results, a lot of women in my family who've worked there, really just, tough people and had to learn how to hold their own there. And it's definitely a story that I partially tell in this book, but I've saved a lot of it for the novella. So I really had that kind of creative space to really go there. That makes sense. But thinking about the intersections of, heritage and gender and business. This book was like kind of the start of a project that's kind of ongoing, especially thinking about how gender works into all of it.
When is your novella coming out?
There's not a date yet. It's still in the editing stages, but
okay. Well,
someday.
Yeah, please let me know when it's coming out.
Absolutely, thank you.
I was thinking, you touched on this here, as you're talking about gender. And one of the things that struck me in the collection in general was, culture, that there are multiple cultures present. And I do not just mean culture of place of origin, although that's certainly part that runs through it. And so I was hoping you could talk to us about the variety of cultures that you wanted to express in this collection.
Yeah. So when I'm writing about the Rust Belt, and I wrote an essay about this a long time ago too, I'm always kind of thinking about both how I'm situated in it, like in my contemporary moment, how my family has been situated in it, historically, how the ways of existing as a Jew have changed in this space. And I'm also always thinking about, how race is operating, how my story is, just one of many Youngstown stories, how the ways that, my life and my family have been, both privileged and oppressed are one of the many ways in which people in this area have intersecting privileges and oppression that, Youngstown is very, very much still dealing with. There's still so much issues with racism and kind of systemic segregation. And so that's the first poem or the second poem I read. I tried to go into that a little bit, that, it's difficult as it's been for, working class immigrants in Youngstown. They still, even the steel mills always had it a bit better than Black workers, for example. It's not that they had it easy. It's just that they had it slightly less bad, than others. So it's a place where, so many people face such hardship. And historically, there's one way of kind of thinking about it and looking at it, but then, in the contemporary moment, what I mean by that is, I don't know how deep you want me to get into this right now, but how politics are functioning in the Rust Belt right now are terrifying and fascinating. Youngstown was very much a Democratic stronghold, very, very strong union culture. But it's also a place that voted for Obama twice and then voted for Trump. So a place which, it doesn't even make sense unless you're from here and you kind of understand. There's a great book. Let me think of what it's called for a second. I'll have to look it up, but it's a great book about looking at how the white working class kind of slowly, especially in areas like Youngstown, have kind of slowly become more conservative over time. And this area just so kind of perfectly charts that. But anyways, in all my work, I tried to make it really clear that Youngstown is a space where all these cultures are there together, and all facing, different degrees of difficulty to survive here, to make it here.
Is it The New Minority?
No, the book is, give me 1 second.
I tried to Google, but I didn't do it successfully.
I write about it nonstop in my dissertation. I should know the.
Okay.
It's probably people in the chat are writing it.
Yeah, not yet, but someone's gonna beat us to it for sure. While you're looking, you can look and talk, because I don't want to throw you off. But if you can talk, like, while we're talking about Youngstown and the Rust Belt, like, one of the things I was hoping you could do, and this might be like pretty obvious, but I just want to, don't want to assume that everybody knows that you're speaking in this, like, that we all know what you're talking about. So can you kind of talk about, like, this setting, this area of the country, and like what sets, like, where are we talking about in terms of the Rust Belt, and what sets that area of the country apart?
Yeah, so the Rust Belt, is, and the project I'm working on now too, with a separate poetry manuscript, is thinking about so areas that are undergoing this process of deindustrialization, areas that used to have a lot of manufacturing or a lot of steel mills, that due to globalization and other factors have lost those primary economies. And this is something that happens not only in America, but all over the world. There are these Rust Belts, these areas that to more or less degrees have not recovered, that are still struggling to figure out, to bring in new industries, to bring in, so I'm just seeing someone relating to the oldest daughter life. Yeah, it's keep fighting the good fight for the oldest daughters. But yeah, so, and in America, the Rust Belt typically, so I'm doing like it kind of just goes along the Great Lakes. These are the places where the steel mills were. So kind of like, Detroit, and then Indiana, Ohio, all the way up to Buffalo. But again, the project I'm working on now is really thinking about the Rust Belt as a global kind of issue, a global kind of recovering economy, a place where people are still trying to figure out what is like kind of the legacy of our past industries, and what's going to happen in the future. Places that have lost a lot of population, places with a lot of brain drain, which is a term that needs challenged in and of itself. But yeah, and also a place I had to work really hard to get back to, because there are not jobs, but it's the place where most of my family still is. So it's really important to me to not lose that. But if you look at, for example, Latoya Ruby Frazier has a really good exhibit of this, but the closure of in my hometown, the General Motor Lordstown plant, and all these people who've been working at this plant for, their whole life, and all of a sudden have to just be uprooted. So it's a place where, people really have this history and this past, often many generations, and then boom, the job is gone, and they have to uproot themselves and their history and their culture in a way that people just take for granted in places where the economy is stable. Like I always grew up with the knowledge of, like, you need to leave. This is not a place to go up to make a family to stay in. But a lot of people are really trying to push back against that, and find ways to revitalize the areas.
I lived for a while in South Bend, Indiana. I moved there in 2000, so from between 2000 and 2002. And when I lived in South Bend, what struck me is people were talking about when Studebaker closed. Well, Studebaker had closed like 20 plus 30 years previously. And to just hear how much that like cut out the town, like that, so that all of these decades later, that was still such a foundation.
They don't recover. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So we have some ideas in the chat. Let me share them. One idea is Jefferson Cowie's Staying Alive.
That's it. That's the book.
Okay. So let me put this up on the screen for people who are wondering about the book that Allison was referencing. So it's Jefferson Cowie, Staying Alive. But there was another suggestion in the chat that I'm going to share because it also sounds really interesting. And it's called Rust Belt Union Blues, Why Working Class Voters Are Turning Away from the Democratic Party. So I'm going to put both of those up so people who are watching at home can see those. And if you're interested, hopefully find a copy of either or both. So, but you were speaking specifically about this Jefferson Cowie, Staying Alive. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. And the full title is Staying Alive, the 1970s and the Last Days of the Working Class.
Right.
Yeah,
Awesome.
excellent book. And it also goes into a lot of really great kind of like cultural analysis of kind of working class film and music. He really is like brilliant analysis of like how Bruce Springsteen operates in our culture. With, I always say Bruce Springsteen is kind of like the Yeti cooler of songwriters, and that Republicans and Democrats both kind of like claim him. And he straddles both sides, and it's really Jefferson Cowie's analysis of him is brilliant. Worth reading for sure.
Okay, this is great. I love book recommendations and also finding books about labor. So one of the things, we've talked, as we said in the beginning, we've had Allison here before. We had a wonderful event in December on this collection, What Things Cost, which is an anthology for the people. And I can't hold it straight, but if I could, you could see it. And it is just an absolutely beautiful labor collection. And so, Allison, like, I feel as I'm reading you, I feel like you're, would it be fair to call you a labor poet? And what does that mean?
Yeah, I try to be, both in the sense of I wrote a lot of these poems while working counter jobs. So I used to I mean, I literally, when I was an adjunct at Ohio State after my degree, I worked at a coffee shop near campus, and I literally would sell my students coffee and then go and teach them. So I think, and I was lucky to have both of those jobs in a way that it's so important to remember that, like, I feel like the culture right now with poetry, we have some poets who really, really make it. And the nature of kind of capitalism, the publishing industry allows a few to really rise up, but a lot of poets, many more than those who make it, are really, really struggling. There are so many graduate students on food stamps. So many people who are really striving to make art in this country, in this economy, in this system, are not only striving to be like labor poets, but are striving to even get jobs. It's difficult out there right now. So yeah, but then this is part of the project I'm working on too, is like this kind of accountability and like what does it mean to write about Youngstown when it's a place that I ended up getting a PhD. I'm a first-gen college student. I certainly am coming to it from like a great degree of privilege. And I do think about that a lot. Sherry Lee Litkin, I'll put her name in the chat here too, is someone I think a lot about. She writes a lot about working class literature and specifically writes about Youngstown. She's one of the founders of the Working Class Studies organization. And she writes about kind of my generation and kind of the ethics of us writing about these places, and are we romanticizing them too much? So I actually quote her a lot in my current manuscript to make sure I'm kind of always in dialogue with both her and like what am I doing? What are the ethics of addressing a place that I have the privilege to even address for this voice. So I think it's anyone who's writing about these places or writing about labor from the perspective of writing about it, and not actually doing the hard physical labor. I think it's a really important question to ask. I think it's, again, also really important to uplift voices that are very much doing physical labor and creating art. And Youngstown is such a rich tradition of that, right? Like in the Youngstown Vindicator, the newspaper, it used to publish steelworker poets. So they were, working the steel mill and also publishing their poetry. And so many steel economies have this if you look at their newspapers. And often, because so many of the workers were immigrants, the poems are in other languages too, being published in American newspapers. So it's, again, some of these great intersections of labor and art. And again, really, really this idea that, poetry does not just belong to the elites and to the rich. There's a very, very rich tradition of labor poetry in this country. Reznikov is also really part of. I mentioned Reznikov earlier.
Right.
Reznikov's parents were immigrants. Sorry, the sun here is. His parents were immigrants, and they were hat makers. And he used to let me turn here so the sun's not in my face. He used to actually finance his poetry kind of like little tours by selling his parents hats as he would go along. So he was kind of like working the family business and writing poems at the same time. So I always thought that was great. He also, he worked as a lawyer. So he self-published his books. He actually he had his own printing press. So he's actually literally making his books. And he was also a documentary poet in that a lot of what his writing, he took his, he wrote like for like a law and dictionary or encyclopedia, and he turned a lot of these kind of cases into found poems. So a lot of his poetry is documenting kind of like legal cases involving exploited workers and involving racism. So it's really kind of thinking about who the law was oppressing at that time and how can poetry kind of help document it and kind of provide witness to it. So again, really important poet, one of my favorites. And he's also known as the walking poet because he used to just kind of walk around and write poems. And he was certainly also a poet who really is walking at street level and documenting just the Great Depression in New York and how people are surviving. So
thank you. I will say,
great poet.
For people watching at home, if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, I'm populating the chat with some links, including a link to the Poetry Foundation about Charles Reznikov. So I have so many. I'm looking at the time and I'm like, oh, I have way more questions than we're going to have time for. So I will say, like, there's so many particular poems that I wanted to talk about. And in one of them, in The Marquee is Empty at the Big Red Saloon, there is this line, and the narrator's father says, if the mother didn't run after her children into the fire, the guard would say, what kind of mother are you? And push her in. This is such a powerful line. And the poem also references the book 17 Days in Treblinka. And I started reading about that book because of finding it in this collection. And in one of the articles I read, the founder of J-Root said, every survivor who is with us today should be treated as a national treasure. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that, about growing up with the specter of the Holocaust over your family and your history and people. And how that.
This is where I talk about Mrs. Shudmak. So my dad, hi Dad, if you're watching, my dad and I, and many generations of Youngstown Jewish students who went to Hebrew school had Mrs. Shudmak as a Hebrew teacher, and she was a Holocaust survivor, and sort of very graphically told her story to many of us when we were like 8 years old, and traumatized us in important ways. But my mom also was in like the Jewish bowling league. And she'd just be friends with these other women she was bowling with. And she noticed one day that they had numbers on their arms. So it's just, a reality of being Jewish is, especially like not so much when I was younger, a lot of people have unfortunately passed since then. But these people who are totally normal people who are, you wouldn't think twice about them. You realize they went through, one of the most horrible events of the 20th century, and some of them talk about it, some of them don't. Not to keep giving book recommendations, but I think this idea of thinking them as a national treasure is important, but I also think some of them don't want to be romanticized that way. And I think of Isaac Bashevis Singer's I'm so bad at titles. Enemies, a love story, talks about Holocaust survivors in kind of like a funny light, I guess you could call it. It's like kind of a very dark comedy, obviously, but such a good book about the legacies of the Holocaust and what people, how people picked up their lives afterwards. But definitely, I think my book, and I talk about the Holocaust in a couple poems, but I really love this. I forget who said it, but someone was talking about Philip Roth's books, and they were saying that none of them are really, really about the Holocaust. And someone else said, like, what do you mean? Like, all Jewish literature post 1945 is about the Holocaust. Like, even if it doesn't mention it, that's really, for at least for Ashkenazi Jewish literature, that's absolutely true. Just the fact that any of us are even here required a lot of people surviving. Yeah.
Thank you. So speaking of other poems that I wanted to talk about, in Language Loosened Back, there was a line about Abby Hoffman yelling at the judge in Yiddish, quote, because you can't gag a person and call the remaining language free, end quote, which I thought was just incredible. And so I was hoping you can talk to us about that and like that idea.
Yeah. So like, man, the Chicago 7 trial, like, it's like unreal. Like literally, this is after like the Democratic National Convention where, you know, the Yippies went crazy. They had this kind of show trial. And the judge literally, Bobby Seale, who was Black and was kind of like yelling at the judge in the courtroom, they literally like gagged him over his mouth in a courtroom, like in an American courtroom, right? So this is like insane, right? And then there's Judge Hoffman, who is Jewish, and Abby Hoffman, who's also Jewish. And Abby Hoffman starts yelling at the judge in Yiddish, and he yells at him, "Hashanda for the Goyim," which is like, you're making a fool out of our people in front of the non-Jews because of how racist you're being and how, you know. And so for me, it's just such an important moment of just Jewish American dialogue, having a younger generation or a more progressive Jewish American screaming in Yiddish in this dying language at this more conservative, politically conservative or more assimilated Jew. To me, it's just such an important moment. And this idea that there's no one true language, right? Like we need every single, if one language is missing from all of us, that it's the language isn't free. You know, no one's more right than someone else. Everyone has to be part of the conversation, or else it's not really a free conversation, especially in an American courtroom. So yeah, and there's a whole, like the transcript, you could read the transcript online for that trial. It's just unreal.
Well, it's powerful. I mean, in the poem, the way it's you've captured and conveyed that in the poem. You mentioned assimilation, and that was another thing that I wanted to talk about. Again, going through the collection, and the collection starts with the narrator's grandparents or great grandparents, and then grandparents and parents, and so one of the things that I noticed in there was that this change in language through the generations, and I felt like it was, you know, sort of capturing this process of assimilation. And just before you answer, I see a question in the chat from a member of the public, which I'll share next. But I do want to say for people listening, please type any questions you have in, and as long as we've got time, we'll share them with Allison. And then, Allison, please, if you can talk about that, this process of assimilation and language.
Yeah, man, ideally I would like know all the languages of my ancestors, and like I wish I could have like written their poems in the languages they would have been like speaking in. But definitely the book is about like the loss of language, and how, you know, kind of the oldest generation in this book, you know, we're not speaking English, and the next generation, you know, grew up, like my grandparents grew up not speaking English. and learning it in school. And my parents grew up speaking English, but understanding, Greek or Yiddish. And then my generation, which doesn't really know anything other than English. I was lucky enough to go study Yiddish, which was really meaningful to me. But yeah, definitely the book is trying to kind of chart this assimilation through the generations.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel, like, if I just do a follow-up question to that, like you mentioned, like, if only this had been, if I could know the language of my ancestors, I mean, I certainly feel the same way. Like, I'm aware of like what is lost.
Yeah.
And yet also for people journey, and so these ancestors of yours coming and this effort to like to belong, this effort to like fit into this place, how, I don't want to say it's at odds, but those, you see this conflict between the, or unintended consequences of those goals. Do you understand where I'm going with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And like Youngstown actually, though, is so interesting. I talked about a little bit in the one poem I read about the Steel Museum. And Youngstown was, in a lot of places that were, that attracted a lot of like poor immigrants trying to, make a better life. The immigrants had to really depend on each other, and they usually lived in areas with other people from the country they came from. So there wasn't much of a need to learn English. And then in the steel mills, actually, at least in Youngstown, there is a real effort to also make sure people of the same background work together. So they wouldn't need to learn English. They wouldn't need a common language. So like Italian steelworkers would work with Italian steelworkers. And the steel companies really preferred this because they worried that if all the steel workers from these different places all learned a common language, all learned English, it'd be easier for them to organize and to unite together and, demand more. So there's actually this kind of effort to repress assimilation and repress the learning of English in this area, which to me is fascinating. And my families did not work in the steel mills. Jews and Greeks actually were two groups that very traditionally owned small businesses that kind of supported these larger economies rather than actually working in the steel economy itself. But my family too, like, my mom grew up living with her great grandmother who mostly only spoke Greek. And my mom, talked to her in Greek. So even that, the realities of, more traditional family kind of cultures where all the family, different generations lived together. That was another way that language was really preserved. So in the book is both about assimilation, like kind of like the more, ironically, like I'm the first generation that really got this privilege of being more educated, but it's also like, I'm also like the first generation in my family that doesn't like, know 4 different languages, so it's, you win and lose,
Right. I have a question. I want to come back to like your personal journey and education, but we have a question here from the public from Murray Davis, who says, how does poetry in the Bible influence your perspective?
I will acknowledge that is my father.
We love dads. We love dads. Yay. Okay.
How does poetry in the Bible influence your perspective? I will say that I did learn a lot of Hebrew from my bat mitzvah, and I didn't know what it meant, but I just learned how to say it. And I knew what it meant because I read the English translation, but I had to learn a lot of Hebrew, a lot of this language that was just pure rhythm because I didn't know the direct translation of it as I was speaking it. And that really influenced how I write poetry in English. But other than that, I think throughout this manuscript, a lot of the epigraphs are quotes from the Torah. Like, for example, in second to last poem, which is about a radio DJ from Cleveland, but the graph is from a book of the Torah, and it's kind of subverted. It's this idea of Shabbat being a time of rest. And in the poem, it's about the motel clerk spending Shabbat stoned and listening to the radio, but in a way that I think that the characters in this collection are religious in their own way. not, in a observant traditional way, but in a way that they're able to find holiness in this place, and find their own sets of kind of revelation in this place. And that's.
Oh, thank you. And again, please feel free, people watching or listening, we would love to hear from you. So we still have time. So I was wondering about your journey. I said that I wanted to kind of come back to that, and I made a note here that you have a PhD in literature and creative writing, and I wanted you to talk about your journey with this because place is so foundational in line study. But as I made the note here before we talked that I didn't think you did your PhD in Youngstown, and we've heard that you went to Cincinnati and then Columbus, right?
In Tennessee for the PhD, yeah.
Tennessee, okay. And so how was that? Did you have parents and grandparents who worked so hard to make lives there, and again also opportunity for so many people in your family? Did they understand your choices, or how was that?
Good. They were concerned at first. No one wants their kid to go into poetry. But it was the one thing I knew I had to do. It was never a question for me. And it's just kept doing it. And I've got so much help along the way. I didn't even know what a Master in Fine Arts was until after I finished my bachelor's, and one of my professors sat down with me and was like, you should apply for this, you should do this. And, the one nice thing with a lot of poetry programs is they pay for your tuition is waived in exchange for teaching for the program. So I was able to afford it in a way that, like, for example, I would have loved to have gone to film school, but it's, so many poets are people who want to go to film school but couldn't afford film school. And they make our movies in poetry. So it was just a way that I just kept applying for things, and luckily was able to always kind of find a way forward doing it. And for me, just a space of like a poetry workshop for people who maybe haven't been in one. You're literally sitting at a table with people and everyone's reading their poems, and you're just talking about their poems and how you can improve them aesthetically. For me, that's was such an important space to me. So we don't have many spaces where you can sit down with other people and like hear my deepest thoughts that formed me. Let's the opposite small talk. And for me, it was just like the first time I really enjoyed like being with other people. Or I'm like, oh, this is the kind of communication I care about. Like, and I, once I had my first workshop, I just, I couldn't stop. I've probably been in like 25 of them. And I really care about teaching, community workshops. I teach at my local library. Shout out to Ohio County Public Library has like such amazing programming and amazing labor programming. And because everyone deserves that space, like your stories matter, what you're thinking about matters, like your really deep thoughts that you're nervous to share about people matter. And we can talk about those and make space for those. And that's, so like having a PhD in poetry just sounds so pretentious and ridiculous, but really it's just people with PhDs in poetry are people who just, they can't stop. It's just poetry is, you would never do it as long as I've done it if you didn't need it more than it needs you. So, yeah.
I love that. And I want to repeat that your thoughts matter and your stories matter, that. We have another question from a viewer, Daniel, who says, I'm curious about your writing process. How does a poem begin to take shape? What do you start with? An image, a story, a concept, all of the above, or something else?
That's such a good question, Daniel. Thank you for asking it. And I'd be curious to your own answer to that if you're also a writer. All of them are different. It's often just this feeling that I need to write, and then the words kind of come, I would say. Usually, though, it's a sense of writing on the page. The page is like great because it's like if you're talking to another person, a human, right? It's like kind of unstable in that you say something, you don't know what they're going to say back, and it's like a conversation is very different than making art, right? Where like the page is like this kind of fixed thing that you can just kind of deliver your kind of thoughts onto in a way that it's there for you. And I recently shared this with my class, but the idea of like if attention, like really paying attention to someone else is like one of the greatest gifts we can give them. Making art is like our way of paying attention to like ourself. So it's like, I'm not really answering your question, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, yeah, there's not one way I think I ever start things.
I think that's an answer.
That's a really good question, though.
Yeah, I mean, you know, because I think it depends. I think what I'm hearing is that it depends what, you know, what has moved you to sit down in that moment. And I
start noticing though, Danielle, thank you. I'm going to ask myself to.
I actually have what sort of turns out to be a bit of a follow-up question for this, just to kind of close this out. And you may have answered this, in which case it'll be a quick close. But I was noticing, okay, there's a lot here, right? There's immigrant stories, there's small business stories, there's Jewish stories, there's Greek stories, there's intercultural stories, there's intergenerational stories, there's American dream and there's really not a dream stories, there's labor stories. And I wanted to hear how you built that. Did you have a vision for the totality of the collection, or did you find yourself with a handful of poems and realize, hey, these are linked, and go from there?
Yeah, I grew out of my MFA like thesis. So I was lucky in that I had professors who kind of pushed me into putting things together. But it took many, many years after that. And then I was very lucky to have my publisher. And again, a major reason I went with my publisher is, again, she owns her own small business, and I really, really trusted her with my vision. And we worked for like a year, I think, doing pretty intensive edits with her and my the poetry editor there, Laura. And it would have been the same book without them. So I just felt so lucky to work with them. But yeah, I always had these kind of different strands, and I just kind of kept reorganizing them. I started out organizing it chronologically. Then I thought more about kind of these themes. And to me, the most important section is the third section, which is the most intergenerational section, where I'm really mixing together stories from my grandfather's stories with my stories, and thinking about our family's history kind of across this duration.
Thank you. You know, so we are at that time where we're coming to the end of the program, but I want to take a couple minutes. And first of all, I want to acknowledge our friends, the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, who are partners for this event today. So thank you to the library. We love our libraries, and Prince George's County Memorial Library System has been a great friend to the Office of Human Rights, and as I said, our co-sponsors of this event today. One of the best ways you can support artists is to buy their work. So this poetry collection really is amazing. It is Line Study of a Motel Clerk. You can get it at your favorite independent bookstore. Ask for it from your library. If your library doesn't have it, ask if they can get it. And then as we talked about, there's also this wonderful collection where you can find Allison's work, What Things Cost. And I do know our friends, Prince George's County Memorial Library System, do have a copy of that in case you would like to take it out. We have a lot of more wonderful programming coming up. We have tomorrow night, we're talking to Katrina Bird, the Boa Flouncer, and we really hope that you'll be able to tune in with her. She's going to talk about writing. She's going to talk about her work with ALS advocacy, and she's just an amazing person. And you can check out all the things we have coming up by going to civilrights.mypgc.us and visit our library friends at pgcmls.info. If you want to see their events, just hit / and events on there, and you'll get to their very, very robust events page. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. You are why we do what we do. So we really appreciate you being with us tonight. And Allison, thank you for coming back for the second time. It was so great to see you. And I love your work so much.
Thank you, everyone who tuned in. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kyla.
All right. Good night, everybody. We'll hope to see you soon.